Hello and welcome to our webinar called How is AI Changing the Teaching and Academic Landscape? This event is hosted by Bristol University Press in collaboration with the Bristol Digital Futures Institute and the University of Bristol. My name is Sanja Milivojevic and I'm Associate Professor in Digital Futures at Bristol Digital Futures Institute and School for Policy Studies, University of Bristol. I am a last-minute fill-in here for my colleague Jessica Ogden, who will not be joining us today, unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances. It is with absolute great pleasure that I introduce the following speakers who are going to be talking to you today. First, we have Mark Carrigan. Mark is a lecturer in education at the University of Manchester. Mark's talk will be on moving beyond the challenge AI poses for assessment integrity to steering these developments in a way consistent with educational standards rather than simply trying to hold them at bay. Mark will also reflect on what space this opens for beginning to grapple with the many other challenges that generative AI poses. And I'm looking forward to hearing Mark's talk first. After Mark, we'll have Ash Tierney. Ash is a lecturer in the Bristol Institute for Teaching and Learning. Ash will look at how the student voice against the voices of teachers and universities has been more muted in conversations about this new technological era. Ash will also present research on student perspectives on the impact of AI on their teaching and learning. And then we have Colin Gavaghan is a professor of digital futures at the University of Bristol. Colin will consider some of the proposals for new rules to deal with generative AI, including requirements that its outputs be detectable. One question I think that Colin will reflect on is whether a next generation Turnitin is the answer to tools like ChatGPT. And last but not least, we have David Beer. David is Professor of Sociology at the University of York and will take a step back to look at how these discussions about AI can be situated within the broader tensions of algorithmic thinking. David will question whether these tensions will persevere and what will they mean for knowledge in the future. As you can see, it's a great panel, so I'm really excited to be hosting it. The speakers will have about 8 minutes for their talks, and that will leave us with about 20 minutes for questions and another 10 minutes for our panelists' final thoughts. I know that there'll be many questions, but this is the webinar, so please type your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will put them to the panelists towards the end of their session. You can also upvote the question you're interested in as well. If you have any technical issues, please don't use Q&A, please use the chat. We have closed caption enabled on this webinar. There is a button at the bottom of your screen. You'll see it says CC live transcript. Please use this to show or hide text as you prefer. The Bristol University Press is happy to notify you that attendees today can order their books at 50% discount. Use the code BUP23 at the checkout. We will share the links during the event. Bristol University Press is also offering a free ebook. Simply add your name and email address to their newsletter list via the form shared in the chat. The form will be there shortly, and a copy will be sent to you. A recording of this webinar will also be available after the event. And after all these lengthy housekeepings, I'm really excited now to hand it over to our first speaker, and that's Mark. Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk today about the assessment crisis, or rather all the things that we've not been talking about because we've been so preoccupied by the assessment crisis. I'm possibly trying to do too much in 8 minutes because I want to talk about some of the key issues that I think have not been addressed. And I'm going to do this by thinking of three challenges that I think are important, three opportunities. These are not exhaustive by any means. These are just some things I've been thinking a lot about at the moment. And the context for it is that we had this initial, I would argue, overreaction to generative AI in terms of assessment integrity. We've now largely moved through this. There's a growing recognition that bans are untenable and that AI detectors are fundamentally problematic, particularly with regards to their impact on students writing in a second or third language. And so what many people said originally is now, I think, on its way to becoming a common sense within the sector, that we need to move towards more holistic, authentic, and contextual forms of assessment. Obviously, this is much easier said than done, and the implementation of this transition is itself a complex and interesting challenge. But I want to raise some of the issues that I think we can now turn to, now that we have an agenda going forward for assessment integrity. The one that concerns me most is the risk that this might lead to a wave of self-defeating automation. There's widespread recognition. British higher education has a fundamentally broken funding model. There's no settlement coming politically that could solve that. And my concern is there's a certain kind of managerial outlook which will look at this and see a way of cutting costs. And I think this is fundamentally self-defeating, even leaving aside the ethics and politics of it, because human oversight is always going to be required. As computer scientists say, garbage in, garbage out. To get quality outputs out of conversational agents like ChatGPT 4 or Claude, we need to have someone who understands what the system is being asked to do. And in this sense, I would say that human expertise is irreducible if we want to use these systems effectively, and to do so in a way that minimizes the risk of hallucination. And in this sense, I'd argue that responsible use will always need to be managed through human expertise. And the reorganization and replacement of labor that is likely on the agenda soon is something that we need to start pushing back at and prepare to push back on individually and collectively immediately. There's a more technocratic issue as well, though, which is the balance and governance in higher education, because there are a huge range of issues here about data storage, transit, intellectual property, compliance. From the university management's perspective, there's a whole set of unclear legal implications because we're going to see the legal landscape change a lot as the current court cases play out. And there's also the ethics of how we make a stance for universities as respectful of knowledge production, as respectful of creative work, as respectful of intellectual property. And the politics and policy of how that plays out within universities is going to be a very complicated discussion. And I feel like there's a lot of conceptual detritus that we're going to need to clear before we can have that discussion. One way through this is going to be the off-the-shelf solution provided by something like Microsoft Copilot. And while this is likely to appeal to an already platformized university, I worry that it's going to reduce flexibility both for individual universities and the sector. And this is particularly problematic when it comes to the ethics of procurement and sustainability, because there's a huge issue here. The energy and resource consumption of these systems is likely to continue to grow, barring some new technological innovation. And the irresponsibility of the sector with regards to the ethics of digital procurement becomes even more pronounced and problematic here. And so we have a question of how we could make a case for more ethical procurement, more ethical practice within universities to address sustainability, as well as more normatively in professional culture, how we balance AI uptake with sustainability commitments, what constitutes responsible use. The things about these systems that excite me at the level of my own scholarship and creative practice, using them as a journal that talks back to you, taking notes in real time and having the notes talk back to you. These are deeply unsustainable practices, and I feel incredibly torn because I'm excited and fascinated by them. But also, is it ethical that these would become mainstream? And how do we actually construct a conversation about what constitutes responsibility in terms of sustainable use? Because at the moment, we're in a situation where we know there's widespread informal use of AI by students and staff. There's a growing trend for people to write about this. I've got a book that will be coming out next year, which is a reflection on using generative AI in scholarship. But there's still fear and uncertainty about what the professional limits will be. And I think there's an unwillingness to have the deep and sustained and reflexive conversations we need, because these experiments are taking place as privatized elements of work. And this is a real problem because it's almost inherent to the systems themselves. They have a multifaceted character. OpenAI, Anthropic, they don't know everything these can do because of the emergent properties within them. And the way in which that multifaceted character plays out across different sectors with different activities and different norms makes it all far more complex. And so we need to encourage and disseminate mundane experiments. We need to have ways of finding best practice, and we need to build communities of practice that can identify beneficial and concerning uses. Because I think there are lots of problematic uses that are emerging, and we need to have feedback mechanisms that enable us to filter these and to begin to articulate what is appropriate, inappropriate professional use, what is appropriate and inappropriate use as a researcher. And as someone who wrote about the landscape of social media in higher education for 15 years, we made such a mess of this, and we allowed such a terrible professional culture to emerge around social media. My concern is that if we don't take immediate action, we're going to see the same thing happening again. But this immediate action, and I apologize for the term agile universities, this is another version of a talk I gave to a very different audience where agile felt like an appropriate adjective. But what I was trying to get across is that it's not just the speed at which we're responding, it's also the connectedness of that response. Because I think there's a real risk that we have a disconnect between managerial statements about generative AI or policies that are formulated by centralized units within centralized universities within a centralized system that are disconnected from the issues people are facing on the ground. And the question of how we have a back and forth, how we have information and knowledge going up and down organizations, so to speak, I think is a very interesting one and will require a lot of changes in how universities operate. And this includes training. As someone who has worked as a social media and in vivo trainer in universities for over a decade, I think training in universities is fundamentally broken. It's overly individualized, it's sporadic, it is done on an opt-in, optional basis, and it's not properly workloaded. And so if we are going to use generative AI to automate parts of academic and professional work within higher education, then I think we should use that time and insist on that time being used for communities of practice, for professional development, for further training. And finally, and this is where I'm perhaps being overly optimistic, and I increasingly see the world in incredibly bleak terms, so I may just be trying to make myself feel better here. But I do wonder if we have an opportunity to insist on a more humane university, insofar as that we push back on automation, insofar as that we push back on thoughtless uses of generative AI, because of the values involved in insisting that we need oversight by human experts. And I use experts in a very broad category here to refer to any sorts of accumulated knowledge within universities, not just academic expertise, because the staff who routinely carry out this work are best placed to do so. And so I wonder how we then develop an agenda about facilitating environments where technology and humanity coalesce. And could we actually make a case for enabling staff to focus on the parts of their role which leverage their skills and expertise, which bring satisfaction, and which bring enjoyment in work and a more sustainable pace of work? And perhaps I'm making a socialism or barbarism argument here, because this does seem unlikely to me. But the only way to push back on the very bleak picture of a further automated, further platformized university in which academic and professional labor becomes a matter of orchestrating automated systems is, I think, to offer a positive vision and to push towards it. So as I said, these are not intended to be exhaustive by any means, but these are three of the challenges and three of the opportunities that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I mean, I have so many questions already, but I think we said that we're going to ask questions at the end, just because otherwise we might not, and we might run out of time. Thank you so much. That was fascinating, really great talk, and a lot of food for thought there. I think Ash is next. Ash, do you want to share your screen? And we'll take it from there.
Yes, it has decided to run forward on me. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you to everyone for having me today. I'm really excited to share some of the most research data that we've just been processing in the last 2 weeks on student perceptions of the impact of AI on their teaching and learning environments. The research is in collaboration with some colleagues at the University of Bristol who are based in the Digital Education Office, Peasy Peasy, and also in the Curriculum Enhancement team at Joe Gould. So many thanks to them as my co-workers on that. So I wanted to highlight a problem that we have, or problems that I see within the literature and within the discourse in higher education. And that is the absence of student voices on AI. There is a little bit of it, but there's really, in my view, not enough. There's a lot of assumptions about student behaviors, about what students are doing, what they're feeling, and there's a lot of silence in the press from the student voice. We see a lot more from the academic voice and from institutional voices, and it's very much muted in the literature. There is a little bit, and it tends to be very much based on survey data, yes, no answers and correlations, and very little in the way of qualitative data. And it's also very geographically limited. So we're getting very little out from the UK, we're getting a little bit from the US, we're getting a little bit more from China and a little bit from Australia, but otherwise it seems quite empty. And we're also, because we're not hearing the student voice, we're not understanding what the students' terms of reference are in relation to what matters to them in terms of AI. And so the solutions that we looked at for the University of Bristol was to run some qualitative based research using focus groups and a follow-up online form, and to conduct thematic analysis based on that, so that we wouldn't be applying terms of reference or our own ways of thinking, our own perspectives, our own boundaries onto what the students were saying, but we would see what the students thought themselves and really let them speak for themselves with the data. We recruited 67 students back in June and July to sit with us and to meet across several focus groups that were quite relaxed, very heavily focused on everything being anonymous. We had 62% of those being international students. It's very much a luck of the draw that time of year, what type of demographics we're going to get in the mix. Majority were postgraduate students with 18% representation from third year undergrad. And we had more representation from life sciences, social sciences and arts, and very little from science and engineering and none from health sciences. So some of the facts and figures that came out of our study: 79% of students are already using AI to support their studies in some way or other. When we ask them how and what they're doing, about 21% of them said they're using it to conduct research. They're asking it research-based questions in support of essays, for example, asking for definitions or asking for a statement of facts. Some of them are using it for revision planning, and this can look very different in different subjects, but a lot of them would ask for revision guidance or notes that they should keep in mind or summarizing of a topic. And then about 8% each for writing material for submission, 8% responding to an exam question, and 8% responding that they use it to prepare code. Now, what students mean by writing material for submission can be very different. Some of them might, in fact, ask AI to write an entire paragraph, or some might ask AI to help give them ideas how to write a paragraph. And so there was different meanings ascribed to that. 9 of our 67 students have never used AI, choose not to use AI. The majority of them in this study said there was a personal or moral objection to using it. One student who is, I would class as a super user in engineering, who does know how to use the software, said that he felt it was very unequitable that he should get an advantage, any advantage in his studies that other students didn't have access to. And until every student had the same access and education that he did not want to use AI because it would be unfair. Some students said that they just don't understand how it works. They don't know where to start. They don't know what the right questions are. And many of them were very fearful of academic penalties. And some of them said it just wasn't applicable to their subject. In terms of their future, what they're thinking, while we do have a 79% using it, only 50%, 56% are certain that they will use it in the future. And we have a real sense of lack of surety to the future. They're unsure about whether they should or shouldn't be using it in the future. They don't know if they'll be allowed, if it'll be the correct thing to do, if it'll be useful to them. So we're seeing that come up in about 36% of students, and about 8% are saying absolutely will not be using it in the future at all for a variety of reasons. So we asked students in our focus groups to give us a sense of what things they associated positively with AI. And when we correlated all the mentions of this together, we could see the weighting of things that they felt were more positive than others. And up at the top, academic support, any type of support for their study skills and study in general came up a resounding top of the line. So that's what the majority of students are seeing as the biggest benefit. And then we're seeing further down the line, some students using it for getting efficiency, sometimes making study plans for themselves, trying to track their time better. And some of them help with writing, and that can be ideas for writing or correcting writing, enhancing learning for reading, equity, and providing feedback. So writing a paragraph and then asking AI to say whether it's easy to understand or if it's answering a question correctly. So lots of different positive associations. And then when it comes to the negative associations, there's a bit, the weighting's a bit less strong right at the top, but academic integrity or academic honesty definitely comes up very, very strongly. Students are very concerned about how AI will bring about a perceived lowering of standards, either perceptions for future employers, or perceptions about their fellow peers if other people are breaching academic integrity, how that will impact them and the perceptions of the value of their degree. Students are also very concerned with misinformation, the hallucinations that AI has, the false facts and the imagined academic papers that it comes up with. And again, equity comes up quite strongly about some students, for example, saying that they're not sure about the paid for services, and some students being able to afford paid for premium services and some not. And then as we go down, we can see instrumental learning, loss of criticality, and loss of creativity are all to do with somehow AI might damage the quality on and depth of their learning, the creativity of their learning, their ability to critically reflect. And some students were saying it was making them feel lazy, that they were getting the AI to do critical thinking for them on their behalf, and therefore would not have the skills, practice the skills, or retain the skills to be able to do that. And they were relying on it. And they didn't like that feeling. They didn't like themselves, they said, when they talked about that. There's quite a few who were concerned about changing the status quo around existential aspects of higher education. And I think that links back into Mark's bigger picture aspects. And then there were also some well-being concerns as well around mental health and well-being connected to AI and having a damaging impact on them. A lack of specificity around what that looks like, but it was coming up enough times to be kind of significant in the data. We asked students as well what kind of policies, positions, and next steps university should take to support them in relation to AI and their teaching and learning. And the first line there says institutional, indicative of the need for some action to be taken by the university. And it wasn't really clear. Students said the university needs to do stuff, but we don't know what the stuff is. We don't have a specific idea of what that looks like, but the university should be doing things, and it should be the one in charge of sorting this problem out, not us. The next down on the rung of the ladder is stuff to do with teaching and learning in general, like AI-informed pedagogy or engaged pedagogy, things to do with quality assurance and assessment design, and other types of curriculum design considerations. And then after that, we can see things like guidance, and that might be advising students on what isn't acceptable in terms of AI use in their degree program. And then we saw a significant number of students also mentioning resourcing, understanding that there might be some physical or digital resources that would be needed to support this within the university. When asked for specific areas of the curriculum that they felt should change in response to AI, I think we're all on the same page, students and academics alike, that assessment is the number one big aspect that should change or could change in response to AI. And then we can see a general mix of design and content of lessons and degree programs, whereas a 7% view that nothing should change at all, that everything's perfect the way it is. We also made a number of observations within the focus groups, and some of this wasn't captured in some of the other methods that we're using for data collection. And so, for example, students were not clear on what is and isn't AI, what constitutes AI or not. And some students are using software and tools that we would class as AI that they don't know is classed as AI, and that came out quite a lot. Some students were very fearful of the return of face-to-face exams as a solution to avoiding AI plagiarism issues. Some students were very emotionally concerned, stressed, and anxious about getting accused of cheating with AI because of the AI detection error rates and mistakes that can come out there. And so we're getting an strong emotional response. Students did acknowledge and understand that there would be huge disciplinary differences, and they just felt that was perfectly normal and acceptable. Quite a lot of students articulated they felt that it was pointless to ban AI. A surprising fact was that there's actually quite a lot of social friction that's emerging within learner cohorts, within their own degree programs and across degree programs where they say are living in halls of residence, where there's lots of disagreements for how people are morally or not morally engaging with this as an issue, and having lots of disagreements on that. And there was a very low recognition within students of the issues of bias and other kind of data problematics that AI has. And that was quite surprising because it is something that's discussed quite a lot. Students had a positive response to AI being used for admin tasks by the university. They absolutely did not want AI to mark their work, with the exception of multiple choice questions. They had a lot of ways of expressing it quite forcefully. We do not want AI to mark our assessments. And there was an emergent existential dread coming out in terms of employability in the futures and the value of their degree, and many seeing AI skills as important to their future careers. So this is a big lot of text. We're not going to read it all, but on the left-hand side column is a bunch of categories of concern that I can see emerging from the academic literature, things that academic organizations and individuals think are issues that relate to the use of AI in university, like curriculum change, like the issues and limitations, and some of the risks and policy and so on. And I wanted to test and see if what students are saying correlates to what the academics are coming up with. And it does largely agree, which is, I think, really reassuring that what we're talking about, what we're worried about, is what students are also thinking and worrying about as well. So that we can see from this limited data set, we're on the same page. And then for the next steps, there's quite a lot of positive things that students are feeling very confident and comfortable with AI, but perhaps we need to focus our efforts on where they're feeling most uncertain and most vulnerable. So where they're worried about learning loss, for example, or well-being or academic integrity, maybe we need to focus our efforts and guidance to students on these areas as a starting point where they have the most reluctance. And some of the recommendations that we're coming out with, I use a quote from a student here: "The toothpaste is out of the tube already." A student said in relation to banning AI being absolutely pointless, because AI is there, we can't control it, and so that's not something that we should look for. And definitely a push towards providing guidance and training that's consistent with itself and consistently communicated and adhered to across organizations, and also to review the appropriateness of assessment, which has come out quite strongly. So that's my data for the moment, and I'll hand it back over to our chair.
And thanks, Ash. Thank you. Great presentation. Lots of questions already in the Q&A section. So rather than me just babbling about, Colin, the floor is yours. You're next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanya. I really want to leave some time for the Q&A, so I'm going to try and keep mine reasonably brief if I can. So I kind of divided my thinking about this up into two parts. So there's the use of AI by educators and the use of it by students. And I think if you view them as regulatory targets for the law and for the rules, they present quite different challenges and quite different kinds of targets, I would say. So educators, I think what we're concerned about predominantly, and it came through there in Ash's research, is the use of AI for assessment and admission decisions. That's really where the rubber hits the road, I think, with regard to where most of the concern arises. Now, look, it's interesting to hear that students don't want AI to be used for their assessment. As someone who marked, I think, 750 scripts in his last year of his last job, I'm very tempted just to say, bring it on, and let's just embrace the future. But there are dangers. I think we all know there are dangers with the use of AI and algorithms in these critical kind of contexts. And We don't even need to be hypothetical about this. I mean, 3 years ago, we got a very good real-world illustration with the use of off-qual standardization algorithm when exams couldn't take place during COVID and university admission was going to be premised on predictions of how the students would have performed. We had enormous fallout, I think, from the use of this algorithm that was seen to be adjusting down the marks from students from not great schools and thereby baking in bias into the system as it was seen. What I think this illustrates is the AI tools, if they're to be used in these critical contexts, what we need is reassurance that they've been properly evaluated for things like accuracy, transparency, and bias. Now, when we talk about accuracy, I want to say, I think that doesn't just mean the error rate. It doesn't just mean being told this algorithm gets it right 85% of the time. It also means being clear what happens when it gets it wrong, who's affected, and in what kind of way, because there's good reason to think that when errors do occur, they tend not to be evenly distributed across the population, that they fall disproportionately heavily on populations that are already doing it toughest. So it means a meaningful account of the accuracy of the algorithm and a meaningful explanation of what happens on those occasions when it gets it wrong. So what would this kind of evaluation look like? Well, we're seeing at the moment, I think, a marked divergence from the UK's approach and that taken in places like the EU, possibly the US as well, given the indications from last week. So the EU's forthcoming AI Act, it's been a long time in the coming, it's been 3 years by the time it finally gets signed off. This is going to make pre-market checks mandatory for uses of AI in high-risk domains. And that will explicitly exclude assessment and admission in education. So that will mean that there has to be a scrutiny of the AI tool for exactly these things, for explainability and transparency, for meaningful human control, and for accuracy. The UK, in contrast, is choosing a different route. Instead of a bespoke regulatory pathway for AI, the UK government seems to be going to rely on existing sector-specific regulators and rules to evaluate the use of tools within their own domains. Now, we don't yet have a very clear sense of what that's going to look like. We don't even have a very clear sense, to be honest, about the coverage across all sectors. I mean, some sectors have a very obviously identifiable domain-specific regulator, like with regard to healthcare uses. Others, it's really not so clear who would actually have that responsibility of checking that the AI has been validated against all of these criteria. Last week's announcement at the AI Summit of the creation of a new AI Safety Institute may offer some reassurance in that regard, but the devil's very much going to be in the detail, and we don't have a great deal of detail yet as to how these rules are likely to work. So what I think we can say for now is that we do need reassurance about these sorts of factors. It cannot be nominal. It can't be a box-ticking exercise that says because a human has some nominal final sign-off on an output, then that constitutes meaningful control. It may or it may not. It very much depends on a number of questions that arise from that, I would say. So happy to talk a bit more of that when we get to it. With regard to students using AI tools, I think I'm inclined to agree with what Mark said. I mean, we originally saw perhaps a bit of an overreaction. Kind of documents produced by the Joint Council for Qualifications, for example, which were very, very heavily oriented towards detection and very heavily oriented towards stressing the malpractice angle of the use of AI in this context. I think, as Mark said, there are quite worrying indicators about false positives in that regard. And if you look at some of the criteria that the Council flag up, indicators that we should be on the lookout for as assessors, you can see where that could potentially happen. So I think it's quite funny. The very first one they have is we should be looking for a default use of language or vocabulary which might not appropriate to the qualification level. Oh, like that sentence, for example. But there's a number of others as well that point to, for example, if the student's use of language in the final assessment is markedly better than their use early in the year, that's something we could be watching. Well, yeah, perhaps it is, but it also might speak to a student whose English wasn't so great at the start of the year and improved quite a lot throughout it. They point to a lack of reference to events occurring after a certain date, which they think might point to the use of an algorithm, the training data for which stops at that point. And it might, but it might as easily point to a student who can't afford this year's edition of the textbook. So I think we do have to be quite careful about what these indicators point to. What about detector software? So we're now seeing the tech industry offering to police its own algorithms in a way by offering up software to pick these out. I think we're a way away from that being very reliable yet, and the possibility of paraphrasing is likely to be spoofing that software for some time to come. But an arms race within the tech sector, the ed tech sector, is kind of a racing certainty. So I think the danger of false positives is quite a big worry in this regard. But really, I think it's the bigger questions that Mark and Ash were starting to allude to there that I'm kind of interested in, which is the question of to what extent we should be putting our efforts into detecting AI and preventing its use. Is that the main thing here? There are actual suggestions that there should be a legal requirement, by the way, for AI tools to have some kind of detector system built into them in future. But is that really addressing the right kind of question when it comes to assessments? One question I've kind of got is there's a spectrum of use of AI. And I entirely take Ash's point about there is no settled definition of what AI even means in this context and what constitutes AI, which is interesting in itself. But at the one end of the spectrum, we've got tools that are really not much different from spell check or Google Translate or things like that, which students have been using for a while and we all accept, and that's fine. On the other end of the spectrum, the use of LLMs to generate answers that the student hasn't even read. You know, you just fire in the question and submit the question. Somewhere along that spectrum is a kind of discomfort zone where we're not too happy about it, but we're not really settled yet, I don't think, on where that is, and that's what we need to be thinking about. Look, our students are going to be graduating into a world where AI tools are real and where they're almost everywhere. And in as much as our role is to prepare them for that world and for working in that world, I think we need to be supporting them as much in the use of those tools as trying to catch them out and preventing them using them. And I think finally, I would just say we also should be taking this opportunity to reflect a little bit on the point of our assessments, because one thing that really struck me a few years ago when I demoed, I think it was GPT-3 at this point for a class, by putting in last year's exam question and watching their jaws drop as they saw the answers churn out, is if AI can already do these exercises better than my human students, then am I even assessing them on the right thing? Is anybody going to be willing to pay them for that kind of work when they finish up with me at university? So I'm having my own existential crisis at the moment about what I ought to be doing with regard to AI. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for now.
Thank you so much, Colin. I just had the same kind of goodness me, what are we doing here kind of moment. It's really great, thought-provoking. Yet another great paper, so many questions. So again, I'm just going to hand it to David. David, the floor is yours, and then I'm looking forward to digging into some of these questions.
Okay, thank you. Three colleagues there. Much more of an expert in the educational aspects of AI than I am. So I'm just going to think about some of the broader tensions that I think might impinge upon the education in the way that it might impinge upon other sectors at the same time. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I've been thinking of as the tensions of algorithmic thinking. And by algorithmic thinking, I mean the thinking that's done about algorithms as well as the thinking that's done by and through them. And also try to incorporate a wide array of kind of algorithmic processes, including things like AI in neural networks and so on, as well as transformations in machine learning and other areas. So I've been trying to work through these questions. Now, one of the things that you can observe in the talk so far and in education as a whole fits with some of the ideas around algorithmic developments more broadly, I think, which is the way in which the sort of present mixes with the future in different moments. So I turn here to Henri Lefebvre on modernity from the 1960s. It's thinking about the way that the future becomes very much a part of the present, a notion of ongoing change. And what Lefebvre says there is there's a kind of myth of a new life. And this myth of a new life is always just around the corner. There's a heightened sense of change coming. And there's a couple of bits from that book. He says, any day now we'd be entering the new life. This life was already there, close at hand, possible, almost a presence, but smothered, sidelined, absent, yet ever ready for the moment when it will be released into the open. So there's a sense of what these AI tools will do. It's kind of a powerful in the present as well as as the futures it will bring. So there's a kind of myths. I would extend Lefebvre's idea to say there's a kind of myths of a algorithmic new life that's sort of just around the corner, about to expand. And you can see that a lot of the political discourse that's going on at the moment, I think. So just very, very briefly, I'm just going to turn to just an idea that's in my book, The Tensions of Algorithmic Thinking, which is a Bristol University Press book. And what I argue in there is that all this to do with algorithms and AI, they're going to be defined really by competing forces and by tension. So algorithmic thinking is always tense. It's always going to be in a set of exist within a set of tensions. And the forces that pull in different directions are going to define the way in which we approach algorithms, how they're incorporated and how we respond to them. So this is a very sort of crude overview of those ideas in diagram form. And this diagram are the kind of competing forces that produce and afford the tensions. And these are the tensions of algorithmic thinking that I think will define the present and into the future. So the forces pull in opposite directions. You can see I've got these on two axes here, the human and humanlessness, and the known and the unknown. And it's not that these are binaries, it's the either or. But if you take the human, for instance, and humanlessness, it's whereabouts things become pitched within that line, within that continuum, depending on how powerful the forces are pushing in each direction. So there's a constant push in opposite directions between the human and the humanlessness, between what's knowable and what isn't knowable once you apply these AI systems within the everyday. And you could see that, I mean, Marx, for instance, in Marx's talk, you got the notion of the pushback, but also the balance of governance, I think was a phrase Mark had, how much human do we put into this assemblage, into this, what Catherine Hales would call a cognitive assemblage. So my argument is, with AI and other algorithmic systems, these tensions will always be there. The frame might move, but will always be pulled in opposite directions. And it's how those forces compete that then define how we apply those systems. So just to conclude, I think we're going to have a tense higher education sector as these systems are applied. The future of teaching academic landscape, I think, will see a constant push between what we can know and what we can't know, and between the presence of the human and the disappearance of the human within these systems. And my final point, really, and I know I've been quite conceptual here, but to turn to Foucault, the notion of the will to know. I think as these tensions compete, what's going to happen is we're going to be in a situation where you've got the will to know, so a desire to discover things, competing with a will to automate. So a desire to automate ever more aspects of the everyday. So I think higher education could be defined by the way that the particular ways the will to automate comes to usurp or mutate from the will to know, and the relationship between those two things. And the problems will come when the will to know is entirely usurped by the will to automate. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All this, as I expected, is one of, seriously, it was so great. Thank you so much. I'm going to dive straight into questions. And please, I'm not sure actually, Bahar, if the panelists can see questions, and maybe they can also choose to answer some of them. I can see Ash nodding, so I'm guessing that you can. So please intervene, and if you see the question that you think is very pertinent and important to answer, please just jump in. There were a couple of questions around definitional issues, and I know that quite a few panelists actually already talked about some of the issues in relation to definitions. There's a question from Pip and from Hannah about, that would be really helpful to define what we mean by AI when talking about student usage, for example, Ash. And does AI actually includes search on translation tools, for example, or it's actually ChatGPT? And related to that, basically, students, you mentioned the students were using AI without actually knowing it. And again, what else comes under the banner of AI? And in that context, when she thinks of AI, she thinks of ChatGPT, for example, not other stuff. So it would be good to actually just briefly reflect on that. Thank you.
I think I can maybe start and then pass over. So the research methods that I used explicitly started by not defining AI to students and have them talk about AI and see what became kind of obvious from what they were saying and what they specified, what their understanding was. So we didn't provide them with a definition at any stage during the research process, but at one stage in the research, we did ask them what they use as AI. And as you can imagine, the vast majority mentioned ChatGPT was the most frequently cited tool, but they also mentioned tools like Quillbot and Google's Bard and Grammarly and GitHub Copilot. And then there was a singular reference to Paper Digest, to Claude, to DALL-E, to Whisper, Elicit, Redbook, AlphaFold, to Elite, Goblin Tools, and WordTune. So there's a big mix of tools there, some which might be familiar to some of our attendees today, and some which might not be. And I can just pop that list down in response to maybe Pip's comment so that people can actually have them written down for reference, because I did say a lot of them in one go, just to make it a bit easier. But yeah, students, sometimes what would happen in our discussions is a student would mention, oh, I've used this AI tool. Another student said, oh, I didn't know that was an AI tool. I just thought that was something that helps you write better or clean up your writing or do a bit of research. And so that was discussion we were getting, but I'll pass it on to the gentlemen if they want to kind of talk a bit more about the definition from industry and from academia about what is AI.
Yep. Do we have any takers from the panel, or should we just...
Yeah, I'll come in there, Sonia, if that's right. Yeah, it's just,
please, David.
I can see the you know, the question, sort of framing of the question is to do with the kind of the everyday aspects of kind of algorithmic structures that are already deeply embedded into how we think. So, and where that becomes artificial intelligence and where it's just kind of everyday algorithmic thing, the line is very difficult to draw. Search engines are already, you know, very advanced forms of artificial intelligence, if you like, embedded in them, in that they're algorithmic systems. So, and neural networks. So we are already all, I would have said, probably embedded in the cognitive structures that are actually extending the way we think through algorithmic processes in different ways. The knowledge that we've developed and that we present today in some way is probably implicated by algorithms that have shaped in some way what we know about the thing we're speaking about. So yeah, I can see the framing of the question. I don't have an answer, because I think actually that's the nature of the problem, is how these terms are used and the type of lives that that terminology takes on is part of it, which I think is probably why Ash started with allowing the participants to define the term.
Can I just add something to that? Sorry, my camera's panning. This is a really interesting discussion. And I'm very torn, because I really like the approach of seeing how the category is circulating in the world, seeing the different meanings it has and starting from there. But the further I've got into this from a kind of practical guidance standpoint, I do see increasingly a really significant difference between multi-purpose conversational agents like ChatGPT and Claude, and other forms of generative AI, which often rely on a kind of templating. And so I'm very interested in how we respect the multiplicity, but also recognize that there are these categories, and the kind of reflexivity involved in them is very different. What I find so fascinating about a system like Claude is that the more you think with it, the more complexity you get out of it. Whereas when I've tried using systems that let you click a button to make this paragraph more formal or make it more friendly or expand it, they're pretty useless, really. And I think they're useless because they're relying on a preset definition of what the outcome should be. And so almost from a kind of methodological standpoint, the reflexivity involved in articulating what you're doing and why isn't there. So I think there's a very different kind of relationship we have to these different types of systems that I find theoretically very interesting, and I'm getting a bit obsessed with it. And also practically, I think it matters for how we guide students and colleagues in the use of these systems.
Mark, this is a great segue actually into and thank you for saying that, because it's exactly what I was thinking when it comes to diversity of AI system and what they can actually do. And you're talking about encouraging experiments to get the best practice and to find the best practice to use these kind of tools. And I think one of the questions was actually also about, there it is, from James. Given the multifaceted nature of AI availability and access, would the panel agree to further methods of rooting out academic cheats, or should we be educating students on how best to use these tools, not just for these things that Ash was kind of pointing out, but also in terms of, critical thinking and exploring certain things that are not necessarily just finding an answer. So in that kind of experimentation is really important. But I do wonder what you all think about the university settings, and both the university settings, but also a publishing setting, if you like, because this is the Bristol University Press sponsored webinar. But how much room is there, do you think, for those kind of tools that are not necessarily just within that framework that you just explained, Mark? And this is a question for everyone, please. And whoever wants to go first.
I might jump in, just so I can pass on the torch in a moment. So one of the things that I saw recently was there are peer-reviewed journals that are accepting AI-generated text in their submissions. There's a few of them out there, and there is a requirement that you'll be quite upfront and honest about which bits are AI generated and not. And I sit back as someone who's dealing with the curriculum all the time, and I put my research-rich theme thinking hat on, and I think, well, if there are students who are going into certain areas and certain subjects where that will become a norm for their discipline, then do we need to do them the service of teaching them how to deal with that from a publishing, of a research-rich perspective? I'm a big fan of getting students to think of themselves as researchers from the very first year of study. Not everyone agrees with me, but there's lots of tensions about this, and in relation to AI and that criticality and that understanding, even how to analyze the results of AI, and how what we might do within a program over the course of a couple of years, to say of an undergrad program. What students are allowed to do in 1 year might change to develop the critical skills before they're allowed to use certain AI tools, for example. And there might be some resistance from students not understanding why we do things like that from a programmatic perspective. But I think it's very complex, and it is very subject dependent. And there will be some subjects where it will be very rarely appropriate to use, and lots of subjects where it will be. I know one of the questions was asking about disciplinary differences. It depends on what we're assessing. So we talked to some of the academics in some subjects in engineering, for example, and they said, we're not valuing the student's ability to put these couple of words in this particular order. We're valuing their ability to do this type of I don't know, maths problem or construction problem or wind flow analysis or methodology. So whether or not they use AI to write, as long as what they're writing is correct, that doesn't matter to us. Whereas in other subjects, it might be hugely problematic. So I think there's some of the disciplinary differences that are coming out as well, which tie into that question.
Yeah, anyone else has a reflection on that? If not, I can just keep going with the questions. There are some, questions are fantastic. There's a question from John, actually, which I think we kind of touched on a little bit as well already. What are some potential consequences of the metaphors we use for talking about AI and LLMs? For example, LLMs as tools. Isn't writing a mode of thinking? If so, what is lost when we begin to offload various aspects of writing thinking to LLMs? Is there a de-skilling concern that emerges at some point? I'm thinking here primarily from a learning student perspective, but I imagine, and so do I, there will be some slippages over time with more experienced faculty and researchers as well. I mean, this is, can I just maybe ask Colin in that sense to maybe just reflect, perhaps to start with whether, do you see that developments in regulation are actually helpful in that sense at all? Or do you think, and for everyone obviously to comment on these slippages that John has just identified in the question? I think it's a very, very important question that I'll be grappling with.
what I've been thinking about, Sanya, is what it means for a legal education. So I'm a legal educator, and a law degree is many different things to different people. In a very simple case, it's about producing future generations of legal practitioners, but it's a lot more than that as well. It's encouraging people to reflect critically on what the law is for, what it can do. Future generations of, judges and, God help us, home secretaries and all the rest of it are going to come from that population. So it's not just about... So law degrees and assessment within law degrees have always tried to get across all of these kind of bases. And I think at some level, simply demonstrating a fundamental understanding of the basics is what we're trying to do. But yeah, I definitely think there is a real danger that we move away from this. Let me put it this way. In the future, I've had students come to me because I'm a future law guy, and they've said, what's the future of law going to look like, Colin? What should I be concentrating on at university? What is going to make me employable in future? And the best advice I can give them is stay ahead of the machine. Be able to do something that AI can't do or can't do as well as you can. And that doesn't look like it's going to be retaining and regurgitating great troves of information, because it's already ahead of us in that regard. So it's thinking creatively and critically and looking for new approaches to things that I think, not just because it's easier to catch students out in assessment, but because that's what's going to matter in future. That's what the market's going to look for from them in future.
Yeah, and in that sense, there's this perhaps, and maybe David, can I just bring it to you in that kind of context of the will to know and that tension that you talk about, and when you, I mean, is this going to be really the most important part of that tension? Sorry, I'm just trying to. I mean, I'm conscious of time. We have a couple more minutes left. I know there are so many questions, and I do apologize to people for not being able to capture them all. But I would like to hear from you, David, about whether you think that this is what that tension might be, in particular, the stuff that Colin was just reflecting on.
Yeah, so it takes particular forms, doesn't it? It becomes embodied in certain ways. And Colin's description there of trying to stay ahead of the machine is that kind of trying to retain an element of the will to know that exceeds the will to automate, I suppose, would be a way of thinking about that. And to go back to the question, the issue around the metaphors used for describing the AI as well, I think that that is an interesting question. I don't, and I think probably there's areas for us to develop our understanding and knowledge there in terms of the types of terminology that are used, and then how that leads to things being developed in terms of the practices, that we could the idea of the tool, I think, was the one in the question that was posed. But the kind of challenging some of those metaphors could be quite a powerful way of altering the perspectives that we've got over AI, I think. Some of the work Jen Chubb, my colleague's been doing, we've been looking at the soundtracks around AI and how those kind of perpetuate dominant narratives around what AI can do. You see those sorts of things all the time. So I think challenging the metaphors might be one way in which the tensions will become real.
Great, thank you. I'm now very conscious that we have 2 minutes left. Are there any sort of I'm giving it back to the panelists and to maybe reflect on some of the questions that you saw in the Q&A that we didn't answer, and I'm sure that I'm just checking with Baha. I think panelists will get these questions, so you will have a chance to reflect on it. But just for now, is there any kind of concluding thoughts or final thoughts on the webinar and the potential questions? Anything at all that you would like to point out at the end?
I'd just like to link Dave's final point to a really important question from Sanjay in the chat about the profound digital inequalities. Because I think when we try and link a kind of social scientific and sociological analysis to practice, we need to find metaphors which help people conceive of the range of possibilities available to them in a constructive, creative, and action-guiding way, but without obscuring these broader hierarchies that are being opened up. And I've thought a lot recently about the work that the notion of a tool does in terms of inequalities, because it grasps who has access to the tool and who doesn't. But I think there are more subtle forms of inequality and the kind of provisioning of that access which get lost by the individualized focus of the tool. So I think we have to build digital inequality into these debates, as Sanjay points to, starting from the metaphors through to the policy and the practice.
just one slightly tangential reflection from me, Sanya, as well. It's about who owns the technology. That came up in one of the questions as well. And I don't know about anyone else here. I use Duolingo to try and gamify my learning of a foreign language. And Duolingo boasts to me when I log on to it. More people are now learning Swedish or Maori or Irish through Duolingo than in any other way, including in language classrooms in those countries. And I think it's most people learning Swedish or Irish or Maori are learning it through this one app run by this one company. And the homogenization of learning, the homogenization of information from that, to me, is a little bit alarming. If students are going to be using tools that end up the same way as social media and search engines has, dominated by one or two super big players, that's something really for us to think about.
Indeed. Thank you so much. And on that note, I think we're already over time. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Bristol Digital Futures Institute and to Bristol University Press for organising this amazing webinar. I think 2 hours wouldn't be enough, really, to be honest, for this fascinating debate. Thank you for all the participants, and thank you to all the amazing questions. Again, I think Baha confirmed that you will get those questions, so hopefully some food for thought there. Again, thank you so much, everyone, and I'm looking forward to continuing these debates in the future.